recording and then I'll catch. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to the AVERT webinar this evening. My name is Dr. Julian Drugan. This evening, we're going to be hearing from Professor Joel Busher, who'll be speaking about violent escalation and inhibition during far-right protest waves. Before we do so, I'm coming from Macquarie University in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Macquarie University stands, the Watamatical clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since time immemorial. Now, tonight's presentation will be coming to us from the UK, where Joel is based. Joel is from Coventry University, where he's a professor of political sociology at the Centre for Police and Security. His research examines political violence, mobilisation and security policies, and among his most recent publications is the Routledge Handbook on Radicalisation and Countering Radicalisation. The presentation will go for about 40 minutes this evening, followed by Q&A. I very much hope that you'll be able to place your questions into the Q&A function down below. Please don't use the chat function. I'll be looking forward to engaging in some audience participation and discussion later on. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Joel to join us and to kick off your presentation. Welcome, Joel.
That's great. Thank you very much, Julian. I'll just get my screen shared. Okay, so hopefully you can see that just fine now.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks ever so much, Julian, for the invitation and to AVERT more broadly. Yeah, it's a real pleasure, and thanks for fitting me into the scheduled presentations. I actually sort of spoke about this or some of this work with AVERT a couple of years ago, a much earlier, I suppose, bit of analysis from this project, as we were just sort of trying to make sense of some of the emerging data. So it's a real pleasure to be able to come back now and talk about some of the key findings from the work and talk in some detail about some of the insights that we think has come from this research. The project is a collaboration between ourselves at Coventry University, colleagues at Oslo University and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. I should also say Oxford University, and funded by CREST. And I've put my co-authors up here. What I'm going to talk about today is based on a paper that is coming out shortly in the American Behavioral Scientist, and also my thanks to the people organising the reviewers there, because we've had a huge amount of sort of input from them over the last few months as this has gone through review processes. So I'm going to talk primarily to that. So you can see the title, so the relational dynamics of violence escalation and inhibition during far-right protest waves. It's a topic that's, I suppose, evolving as we're seeing the nature of far-right protest evolve at the moment. But is one that obviously has quite a lot of salience globally at the moment. So just by way of something of an introduction, our core questions, what was sort of really driving this project, was trying to understand what the pathways are towards escalation during periods of intense mobilisation by far-right groups, by anti-minority groups. When we say intense periods, we were interested really in periods of mobilisation that tend to be focused around specific sites. Now, they're not uniquely focused there, but they often do tend to have certain geographic spaces that become the focal points for those waves of protest, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We were also interested in what inhibits further escalation of violence during those periods of intense far-right protest. So that was our kind of core questions. the funding call that we were responding to and the funders are very much kind of policy and practice focused. And so as you can see, these are questions that have, we believe, very obvious relevance for policy practitioner communities. And again, we can talk about that later on. So there's a real practical motivation to this research. We're interested in how we can do more effective analysis and management of waves of far-right protesting, and how do we respond more effectively to them, but also how do we understand kind of the emerging dynamics of these far-right protest waves. We're interested in how we anticipate emerging violence dynamics, and also how do you curtail those, how do you curtail violence that's associated with far-right protest. But there's also theoretical interest for us. There's been a sort of slew of research over the last kind of 15 years or so, a lot of it inspired by Randall Collins's work on violence and the situational drivers of violence, so how violence emerges out of situational encounters. That has really sort of advanced our understanding about how violence happens, not just in protest context, but also in a whole range of other contexts, whether it's sort of street fighting, whether it's within domestic contexts, what have you. So there's a sort of rich seam of research there, and we were responding to that and trying to particularly respond to some of the limitations on that relevant to thinking about protests, and that's I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. The research also sort of spoke to an interest that myself and colleagues have had for a while now in understanding restraint within radical milieus, within groups that use some violence. So essentially, most groups that we look at have the potential to do more violence than they do. So trying to understand, okay, what are the levers that are being pulled? How are they sort of establishing and maintaining those parameters on violence? So we're speaking back into that research as well. And I'll talk about how we did that in a minute. So, as I said, in terms of these situational approaches, they have been very effective in terms of helping us to explain why violence happens, why it emerges in particular contexts, so in particular protest contexts, for example. But there are also limitations to some of the situational approaches that have been highlighted, and so the idea is that you have violence favouring situations that emerge that then make violence happen. So one of the main contentions that Randall Collins has is that actually violence is harder to do than we often imagine, and so often people get to sort of the edge of violence, but then don't undertake violence. And this is sort of borne out very well, looking at all sorts of different types of sort of protest and contentious action. There can be lots of sort of hostility, but violence doesn't actually then take place, or not in a very kind of pronounced form. So these kind of situational approaches have helped to explain sort of how people overcome what Randall Collins calls situational tension and fear, how they actually go ahead and do violence, or how violence emerges out of these situations. But there's some limitations with that. Some of that has been around how do you explain how those violence favouring situations actually arise in the first place, and what can inhibit their emergence. And also some of those kind of theoretical explanations have not been so good at explaining why some situations that seem to favour violence don't actually give rise to violence, or don't give rise to the kind of sort of escalation of violence that we might expect. So in order to respond to those limitations, what we've done is we try to sort of pull in different strands of research on political violence. And I'll just talk briefly about what those are without sort of going too deep. One of those is the strand of research that's about relational approaches to political violence. So the idea of looking at relational approaches says that, well, violence emerges out of interactions between different sets of actors. And we can imagine all the different types of actors who might be involved. That might be protesters, might be counter-protesters, might be police, might be like public authorities, it might be bystanders, what have you. So it might be media. So we've got a whole range of different actors that we might be interested in. The relational approaches, so well, one way we can think about this is by looking at what's happening in the relationships between these different sets of actors, try to analyse that, and that gives us a picture of how these dynamics are evolving. So this is kind of the relational approach, and it's been used quite widely. So people like Eitan Alimi, Donzel Della Porta have made a lot of use of this, and it's really sort of become a very sort of influential strand of work on political violence. A common model inspired by people like Eitan Alimi has been this approach that I've sort of captured on the screen. So saying, okay, well, if we want to understand violence associated with a movement, with a group of, with a protest, we need to look at these a range of different relational arenas, and this could be within the movement, it could be between the movement and the counter movement, between the movement and the wider political environment, so political elites, cultural elites, between the movement and security forces, so police, intelligence agencies, and between the movement and the wider public. So part of what we did was we used that to structure the analysis of the cases that I'll go on to talk about in a minute. The next kind of strand of work on political violence that we drew on was this strand of research that is focused on understanding political violence as a process and understanding how violence evolves at what we sort of describe as different levels of proximity to the action, to the violence itself. Okay, so what these approaches do is they sort of say, okay, well, how do we trace over time the sort of evolution of these dynamics, recognizing that this sort of chain of events can kind of develop their own logic. So we've done this, the way we sort of operationalize this was trying to look at the situational encounters in a way similar to Randall Collins. So look at the situational encounters, but then outside of that, try to look at what's happening as people prepare for the protest event. So we call those the planning contexts, and then also sort of wider than that, what's going on within the wider movements at the time. Okay, so there's sort of three different layers, and then the other strand that we drew on was the strand of work that I mentioned about restraint within radical milieus, and that sort of goes back to some work that I put on here, a special issue of Perspectives on Terrorism that I edited with Tori Bjurgo at CREX in Oslo. There's a whole range of sort of super articles in there, but all of them sort of exploring this idea about actually identifying where restraints coming from within these milieus. So what we did in terms of our analysis, we were interested both in violence enabling mechanisms, but also violence inhibiting mechanisms. So, you know, if we look at a lot of the work about political violence, a lot of it is very focused on the violence enabling mechanisms. And what we tried to do in this project was to say, okay, well, can we look simultaneously at violence inhibiting mechanisms, and what are the analytical advantages that gives us? And as I say, I'm going to try to illustrate that in a few minutes' time. Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly about the research that we actually undertook. So the case studies we were looking at. So we were looking at 4 case studies. These cases were selected because all of them contain instances of violence beyond what we refer to as normal levels for the groups involved. Okay, what does normal levels of violence mean? Our answer to that is that we mean normal levels relative to the actors involved in those waves of protest. Okay, it sounds like a fudge, but it's kind of not, because actually the levels of the sort of normal levels of violence within these different cases are very different. Okay, so the cases and it's important to, I suppose, measure them against themselves rather than against sort of an imagined sort of consistent norm. The cases, so I should have said, were Dover in the UK, 2014 to 2016, where we saw some of the most significant far-right street violence in the UK since sort of early 1990s, an escalation of confrontations over quite a long period that resulted in some very violent confrontations and over 80 years of custodial sentences being handed down. Sunderland in the UK, again, a long period of mobilisation that we saw involving some of the sort of most radical elements within the far right. Some violence initially in the campaign, but actually relatively little violence over the longer campaign. This was a series of campaigns based around allegations of sexual violence carried out by migrant men. Then Chemnitz in Germany in 2018, events that probably people will be familiar with. So some very significant street-based violence that took place there, and also Charlottesville in the US, 2017, again, events that people will probably be quite familiar with. The very significant violence that took place around the Unite the Right rally and the build-up to that. So within this case, that we were interested in sort of the build-up to the violence as well. So as I said, these cases all saw some violence, so that went above and beyond the kind of violence that we used to observing that involving these actors. Hence why they all became relatively well known, really. There's also sort of interesting points of contrast between them. So the Dover case and the Charlottesville case, we both see a build-up of violence over a series of demonstrations, over a series of months. I mean, both of them actually over a series of more or less a year of sort of build-up towards what is then sort of the most significant violence, and then a drop-off. Sunderland and Chemnitz, the other way around, we see an initial spike of violence around a trigger event. And then in the Sunderland case, we see a very quick drop off from that, and then sort of sustained protest, but scant escalation over time. In the Chemnitz case, we see a sort of a slightly longer period of very significant violence, and then a tail off. So those are the cases that we're looking at. The research was based on mixed methods, so a combination of fairly extensive documentary evidence, online research, including some social media analysis, so looking at sort of large platforms. Relevant to this time was particularly Twitter, but also things like Telegram and the Chans, where relevant. Also interviews, so 61 interviews with people involved with the events, from a range of roles, from police, local authority, anti-racism actors, and also some of the people involved with the protests themselves. So a small number of far-right organisers were also interviewed as part of the project. The distribution of methods across the cases varied, depending partly on the availability of materials. What we did with the data was then try to so we created very sort of detailed case histories for all of them. Those are all available in a report that I should have put a reference onto. But if you go to the CREST website and put hot periods, you'll be able to find the report. Very detailed case histories there. And what we did with the case histories was then go through those case histories and start to try to tease out mechanisms that would be either violence enabling or violence inhibiting mechanisms. So by mechanisms, what we're referring to are what Guérin calls the pathways or processes by which an effect is produced. Okay, so what he calls the minimal definition of a mechanism. For a mechanism to count, what we were saying was it had to be present within one or more of the cases, and it should either produce a similar outcome each time they manifest, or there should be a clear explanation as to why it didn't. why it didn't manifest, why it didn't produce a similar outcome. Sorry. So that could be because there's an interactive mechanism, or there could be a counter mechanism. So that's what we were interested in, trying to sort of document these. And what we did was we went sort of between the cases and the list of mechanisms. The list of mechanisms evolved and continued to evolve for a long period. We went backwards and forwards between the cases and the sort of list of mechanisms. And we would then test the mechanisms back into the cases to give us confidence that they were describing sort of the same thing across the different cases, and they were capturing the same phenomena. I'm happy to talk about that process because it was arduous, and I think I'm still probably coping with the after effects of it. Eventually, we had a list of 21 violence-enabling mechanisms and 19 violence-inhibiting mechanisms. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and talk through those mechanisms. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would take a very long time. But I'm going to sort of run through them arena by arena, and I'm going to sort of pull out what I think are some of the most interesting points around some of them. So some of the mechanisms are very much, I think, what we would have expected and kind of speak for themselves. Some of them aren't really what we expected or work in what we think are quite interesting ways. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And if I can work out technology, I'm going to try to then also sort of illustrate that by sort of at least maybe reading one of an extract from at least one of the cases, so you can see how these mechanisms help us to illuminate the processes that were taking place within these cases. Okay, because I think what's interesting is how these mechanisms and how understanding this range of mechanisms and how they interact with one another enables us to, I suppose, kind of look underneath the bonnet a bit at what's happening within these waves of protest, and gives us a sense of what's driving them towards or away from violence, and sort of by extension, how we might think about responding to those waves of protest. Okay, so to start off first within the within movement arena. Okay, so this is for the within movement arena. We're thinking about interactions between actors who are part of that far right milieu. They're not all from the same organisation or group necessarily. In fact, there might be might be no love lost between some of the people, but it's people who kind of mobilise at least some of the time together. So yeah. So in the within movement arena, I'm going to focus mainly on the violence enabling side because to a large extent, the violence enabling and violence inhibiting are a mirror, but there are some violence inhibiting mechanisms that aren't mirrors, and I'm going to flag those. So look, just running through these, intensification of threat narrative. In each of these cases, mobilization is accelerated by a sudden intensification of threat narrative. As I said, Chemnitz, Sunderland, trigger events, and that's where the intensification happens. In Dover, it was on the back of the so-called migrant crisis in Europe, and a sort of ratcheting up of that threat narrative. In the US, the sort of removal of Confederacy symbols and how that was then mobilized. The intensification of threat narrative itself doesn't lead straight to violence. What it does is it accelerates mobilization. It draws more people in, which produces some of the dynamics that actually then make violence more likely. Foregrounding of revolutionary goals, that's a fairly obvious one, but the interesting counter is the B1.2, foregrounding of non-revolutionary goals. One of the things that we see happens in Sunderland case is this kind of sort of framing sort of switch that happens straight after the initial violence, where they frame the campaign in terms of putting pressure on the system to deliver to people rather than sort of overhauling the system, the justice system, and that's really important in terms of how it shapes the rest of the campaign. So yeah, declining influence of moderates. Again, fairly self-explanatory, but we see this happen in different ways. So in some of the cases, moderates' influence declines basically because they fall in line with the more radical aspects of the movement, of the mobilization. In other cases, moderate's influence declines as they basically step away. And I'll talk about that. I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. Valorization of violence, fairly obvious. Identification of violence as a viable or necessary strategy, again, fairly obvious. Fear of missing out is one that we hadn't really thought about before we did this work. But one of the things that you see in all of these cases is where violence happens, one of the ways that people become drawn in and people become accepting, and movement moderates become more accepting of violence, is this fear of missing out dynamic. So yeah, sort of FOMO, and it sort of accelerates the mobilization, and yeah, it changes the preparation for these events. So that was a really interesting one for us. And the preparation for violence is fairly obvious, but I'm going to flag B1.7. So I don't know if you can see my buzzword on the bottom, my mouse on the bottom right. Within movement backlash against inappropriate violence. Yeah, that's one that it's quite interesting seeing the importance of that post-event. So this isn't just like leading up to the event, but actually when violence happened, people within the movement saying, you know, that went too far, and then trying to pull back. And actually one of the, again, part of the story in Sunderland is that it followed after Dover. And part of what was happening was people within the movement saying, you know, we lost a lot of support, and then people trying to pull back from violence after that. Okay, so I'm going to jump forward to the next arena. So the next arena is the interaction between movement actors and opposition actors. In most cases, this was anti-racist or anti-fascist actors, but also to some degree, in the Sunderland case in particular, also, and in Germany, groups of yeah, so different groups of people of colour, essentially. So in Sunderland, local South Asian networks, in Chemnitz, again, a variety of organisations, people of colour that weren't necessarily kind of anti-fascist groups. So there's been quite a lot of discussion about the interactions between activists and their opponents, and the ideas of potential sort of reciprocal radicalisation. And what we were interested, I suppose, in was trying to dig a bit more into those interactions and say, okay, well, where do we see them kind of pushing towards violence, or actually where do we see them not doing so? So one of the clear things you can see in all the cases is that what seems to be pushing towards violence is what we've called this increasingly hostile emotional entrainment between activists and their opponents. So that's very much what Randall Collins would tell us to be looking for. You know, are they becoming really focused on one another and trying then to kind of just, you know, are they becoming locked in competition and trying to achieve dominance over one another? But again, then the flip side of that is where they become tactically or emotionally disentrained. In some cases, that's because they're looking at other issues, or they kind of have bigger fish to fry, or they choose not to engage. So again, the Sunderland case is an interesting one because we see this sort of drop off of violence. One of the things that happens in the Sunderland case is that the anti-racist organisers don't try to oppose directly the far-right organisers, because basically they take the view that the optics would be bad because the far-right protests were being organised as being around protecting women and children. But this tactical disentrainment reduces possibilities for violence. Running through then, so increased mutual expectation of violence is fairly obvious. We see that across all the cases. Increased availability of legitimate targets. Now that can happen in different ways. It can be because of what counts as legitimate, hence we've put the scare quotes. So who's identified as a legitimate target? As that expands, it creates more targets. But increased availability of legitimate targets can also be about what happens at a situational level. So all of a sudden you have greater access to the people who you might want to do violence to. So, you know, a police line breaks and then people come into contact with one another. And again, in almost all of the cases that we're looking at where violence happens, it's basically where police lines break, or where people find a way around police lines and violence ensues. And again, very much in line with the sort of the situational approaches, these sudden power imbalances, A2.4, sudden power imbalances between opposing groups in situational contexts. So what Randall Collins tells us is violence becomes most likely. So when you've got two evenly matched individuals or groups, you get this kind of stasis, and they face off against one another, but they don't actually engage in violence. Some of the video footage that we were using to analyze these cases, and fortunately we were able to access a lot of video footage, a lot of it put up by activists themselves, but there's some great video footage of groups of activists coming together, and you're thinking, you know, this is gonna kick off, and it kind of stops. There's a bit in one of the Dover protests, so that precedes the most violent one, where these two lines kind of come together, and then there's this moment of standoff, and that's the situational tension and fear that Collins talks about, and they kind of stop. So there's that sort of power balance, and then it kind of stops for long enough for police to get back in there. Whereas when you see that power imbalance, and that could be, you know, someone falls over, or it's a much bigger group against a smaller group, then that's when we see the most significant violence. And again, that's pretty consistent across the cases. So these power imbalances. One of the interesting ones for us in terms of violence inhibiting here was B2.5, the achievement of dominance without need for further violence. Again, this isn't something that we had thought about prior to this project, and it kind of speaks to one of the criticisms of some of the work on situational dynamics. Unverdoben has done some really interesting work about some protests in France where violence happens but doesn't kind of escalate and continue as might be expected according to the kind of Randall Collins model. And we think this speaks to this point. We can see again in the video footage and in the photographic evidence, a number of cases where people kind of achieve dominance and then they just move on. They kind of move on to the next target, if you like. And that kind of sets something of a cap on violence. Yeah, which is interesting. There's some video footage that we mention in the forthcoming article, which is, to us, illustrates this really well. In Dover, at one of the most chaotic points in the violence, anti-fascist and far-right activists are engaged in violence with one another. There's an anti-fascist activist who gets knocked to the ground. The far-right, the front of the far-right group kind of pushes on past that individual. One of the far-right activists puts the anti-fascist in the recovery position and then gets straight back into doing violence against others. And it's this sort of extraordinary, it's something that we didn't expect to see, but we've kind of tried to capture that in this idea of, so it's a violence inhibition. I suppose it's sort of violence limiting, maybe in that case would be a better descriptor. Okay, so I'll move on, I'm mindful of time. Political environment arena. Okay, so here we're thinking about the interactions between movement actors and the sort of the wider political environment, whether it's sort of politicians, it could be also sort of cultural elites, what have you. So again, very much in line with expectations from the literature, diminishing political opportunities seem to sort of push towards people pursuing greater violence, which is what we would expect. In all the cases, we see this sort of growing identification of corrupt elites as the enemy. Again, that's quite typical, but it's as they shift towards seeing them as legitimate targets. So again, one of the inhibitors on violence is kind of not seeing the police themselves as legitimate targets for violence, because they're sort of part of the system of order that far-right actors tend to support. So actually starting to see them as, or sort of seeing politicians themselves as sort of suitable targets, legitimate targets, that then becomes sort of violence enabling. In all of the cases, the more radical acts are becoming a focus of political or media attention. Is violence enabling, in part because of the way that it builds momentum around the protest campaigns, and it also encourages a radicalization within opposition movements. The endorsement of polarizing issue frames by members of political or cultural elites, an obvious one, and also legitimation of violence by members of political or cultural elites, which we see particularly in the US and German cases. One of the interesting things here, and I hope I have time just to come back to it, is an apparent kind of tension between, if you look at sort of A3.1 versus A3.4 and A3.5, they seem to sort of sit in tension with one another. And as I say, I'm going to try to come back to that if I have time at the end. Movement security forces in some ways was the most straightforward one. Also one that has been studied quite well already, so no great surprises here. Violence enabling mechanisms were communication breakdown between activists and security forces, either before events or during events, and loss of control by state security actors. And again, consistently, all of the significant violence involved those violence enabling mechanisms. And finally, the relational arena between movement and the wider public. So again, we see this kind of interesting tension that I mentioned in the movement political environment arena. So here, the violence enabling mechanisms we've got, the decoupling of the movement from the general public sits in kind of tension with A5.2 and A5.3, so the endorsement of polarizing issue frame and the legitimation of violence. Okay, so just remember that tension, and we'll come back to that just now. I'm looking at time, and I think I'm probably going to struggle to do what I was wanting to do. How can I also can't work out how to do this. Okay, so what I can't really work out how to do this. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to then read one of the. How do I get off? Apologies. So I thought I was going to be able to read off a section about one of the cases, but I can't. So what I wanted to do was to take you through then one or maybe two of the sort of the short case histories that we use in the article, because what those do is they really illustrate how you can kind of tell the story of the cases using these mechanisms, and you can tell the sort of the ebb and flow of moving towards greater violence, but also then what inhibits that. So actually, during the research, what we did is we created what we called storyboards. Sorry, this is a horrific slide to leave you looking at. I'll reverse one. So we created what we called these storyboards, where essentially, we took the idea actually from a team member who had been looking at how you kind of use research to inform writing literature or fiction based around sort of social science analysis. But we found it really helpful because it got us to kind of focus in on, okay, well, we can see these mechanisms, and actually you can almost see them interlocking with one another. And as you do it, you kind of see, okay, well, this is, yeah, like the explanatory strength seems to be quite strong. Now, of course, we're not trying to be predictive at that point. We're just kind of fitting a story together, and I think we'd be cautious about saying about sort of using this in a more predictive way, but actually using it in a descriptive way is you're trying to understand what's happening around you during a wave of protests. That's where I think we see the potential for it, because part of what it does is it helps you to see what the real drivers are. So, for example, in the Dover case, what's really driving the violence forward is a humiliation revenge dynamic between the far-right activists and their opponents. And this is kind of the core mechanism, but this was missed. This was really missed by public authorities in preparation for the event that turned most violent, because they weren't looking for that. They were looking very much at how do you manage the risks around each individual event, but they weren't seeing these events as a series, and as a series taking place actually across the whole country. There was a series of very violent demonstrations that took place in Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool. The events in Dover were being seen as payback, and far-right actors knew that you didn't have the same anti-fascist strength in Dover. So this it was being driven by that, but that was missed. So we think that's where some of the real potential is. I'm going to jump over that one. I'm going to make just two more sort of final points. So we found the bringing together of these different elements: the situational, the relational, the processual, and the restraint. They all brought value to the analytical frame that we were using. They certainly support the assertion of people like Randall Collins and those who have sort of followed him about the importance of these micro-situations, of this kind of situation analysis. But they also highlight that we can sort of push further upstream from that in terms of understanding emergent violence around these waves of protest. With the relational one, I think one of the limitations that we identified was that actually we had certain blind spots when we were doing the analysis. So we were looking at everything in relation to the movement, but actually some of the important variables, some of the important mechanisms are happening outside of those arenas. And actually there are other relational arenas that are important. In particular, the relational arenas involving the counter movement and their relationship with security forces. So in Charlottesville, a really important element of what happened was the breakdown of communications between anti-fascist activists and state security forces in the US, which made liaison much harder coming into the Unite the Right rally. Also, interactions between different parts of the security forces in the US, and that's sort of borne out in public reports. So having an eye on these other relational arenas is important, and that's one of the recommendations that we would make, would be that it's important to not to lose sight of those. But the other thing I'm just going to end on, and I've sort of been trying to find ways to talk about this for a while now. One of the things that comes out, and this is where we come back to those tensions that I was highlighting between the mechanisms in the movement political environment arena and the movement public arena. One of the things that we were trying to resolve, okay, how to explain this tension? It's not comfortable having mechanisms that seem to contradict one another appearing, and the way that we've resolved it is to think in terms of saying, well, actually, we think there are different protest ecologies that we're looking at, and there's one ecology which we call movement emboldened, and one that we call movement marginalised. In the movement emboldened ecology, the relational configuration is one, I suppose, characterised by far-right actors having a growing, or at least growing, sense of support within at least parts of the political mainstream, and at least parts of the wider public. The movement marginalised protest ecology is characterised by hyper-marginalisation. And they have different associated violence pathways. So the movement emboldened one, and this is sort of best characterised by what we see in Chemnitz and in Charlottesville. The associated violence pathways characterised by sort of perceptions of support from key political, cultural allies, and they perceive that those allies and key constituents in the public will ultimately side with them over their opponents, regardless of violence. So that's the sort of, so they start not to worry about appearing too violent, because they think, well, they're going to have our backs anyway. The moderates there lose influence because they fall into line with the radical flank. Okay, so that's the movement emboldened pathway. The movement marginalised, the associated pathway with the movement marginalised ecology is that these activists become just completely decoupled from wider movements. They're not trying to, engage with political movements or political movements that have any kind of traction at all. The moderate influence wanes because moderates step away because things start going too far, and they don't really care about public support or the optics of their events. And, Dover, we see this as a sort of paradigmatic case. By the time the activists get to Dover, even the National Front, sort of national leaders have stepped away because they can see the direction that this is going. The activists have got no interest whatsoever in sort of building wider alliances. They're just trying to compete with each other to see who can be the toughest, and it's it produces this violence. That's quite a different pathway to what we see in the movement emboldened protest ecology. We think these are really important. Not so much in perhaps not so much in terms of how you manage the protest itself, but in terms of how you think about threats emerging out of these waves of far-right protests at a wider level. Movement marginalised, it can be managed really as a sort of public order thing in a fairly straightforward way, because there is just, that there aren't those attempts to kind of build legitimacy. The movement emboldened, violence coming out of movement emboldened is much harder to address, and potentially is of much greater societal significance. And I'm going to leave it on that note because I can see the time's running away and I've overrun, and my apologies for that.
Look, thank you very much, Joel, for an excellent presentation. I particularly like you bringing some data and some detail and some nuance into how we understand these processes and these processes as well. Now, we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I'd really like to encourage everyone to keep putting your questions through the Q&A tab down below as we go. But I'll begin with the first question to Joel. We might be able to start some discussion in these areas. And I wanted to ask, one of the questions is whether you noticed any differences in how far-right protests played out in different regions. So in the UK, Germany, the US, differences in terms of what triggered the violence, but also in what prevented the violence as well.
That's a great question. Look, I guess what we were trying to do was to identify mechanisms that work across different geographies. And actually, the triggers to violence, if you like, are fairly similar, really, across them, whether we're talking in terms of what kind of pushes these optics in mobilization, or whether we're talking in terms of what actually makes violence happen during the events themselves. Okay, so we see the kind of, that's fairly consistent. But there's quite important differences in terms of the relational configurations. And again, this is where the kind of the relational approaches are helpful. So in the US, the sheer complexity of law enforcement is highly relevant to how these types of events play out. So in the US, in Charlottesville, you've got multiple police authorities involved. In the UK cases, you consistently have only one. There are differences there that are relevant. I think you also have important differences in terms of the political configurations, and I think this is one of the things that we kind of get to with this idea about the protest ecologies. In the German case in particular, this belief that you have powerful political actors who have your back is highly relevant. That's not there in the UK cases, not the ones that we looked at. But so I think there are really important relational differences. So people at parts like AFD would absolutely say no, they don't support violence. But their interactions with these activists and the fact that some of the statements were sympathetic in terms of what was being done, that was important because it didn't establish that this has gone beyond the pale. So yeah, there's really important differences in terms of prevention.
So in terms of the next step then, if Australia can learn lessons from these examples from the UK, Europe and the US, do you have any suggested, recommended concepts, ideas, practices for Australian policymakers or even community groups, how they could practically influence these protest ecologies, reduce the likelihood of violence in protests?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say this with all humility, because I know there's a huge amount of sort of accumulated knowledge in the Australian context. I do think for anywhere, I think it's really important for policymakers and practitioners to get their head around these different ecologies and try to understand which one it is they're looking at, because that makes a difference. So I think introducing that as a step in terms of how we think about responses is really important. And I think that's something for the UK as well. The UK context is changing, as some of you are probably aware, and as we're all aware, the US context is changing rapidly and significantly. As these contexts change, I think this point about the different ecologies is really important. I think the other thing that I would say is that I do think there's real value in taking this kind of framework as a protest wave evolves. I'm not talking about managing specific events, but as a protest wave evolves, and using this to try to sort of pick apart what's happening, and where we can see mechanisms that are really pushing towards violence, but also where we can see mechanisms that are inhibiting. I think that's really key, because if you can find those mechanisms that are inhibiting, then the question is, are there ways that we can reinforce those, or are there ways that we can protect those? And I think one of the big things there is around role of moderates, influence of moderates within those movements. Are there ways that you can not undermine them? And I think that could potentially be a key thing. So yeah, I think we can use these tools to help us analyse what's happening within these protest waves, and we can probably do that as the waves are unfolding. But I think that's as much something that the UK really needs to learn as Australia or anywhere else.
Yeah, look, thanks for that. And we have some questions coming through that are adding, I think, to this discussion. You've touched on the inhibiting processes already, but we have a question really around speaking to the movement emboldened dynamics, specifically in terms of the de-escalation of that pathway. And the question is, I think we can all see the violence promoting mechanisms, but can you underline some of the key inhibiting paths here specifically?
No, it's a very tough question, because I think if you look globally at the moment, it's hard to find cases where we would say that that inhibition is being highly effective, in all honesty. So I think one of the clear things when we're looking at that is that you have fewer options in terms of the kind of straightforward police response, right? But I think in terms of inhibition, I think there are. I honestly don't think there's kind of a straightforward answer at the moment. So we've been doing a bit of work with people in Chemnitz over the last couple of years. They're one of the European capitals of culture at the moment. And one of the things that we've been doing with them that has been inspired by this, but they've really kind of taken on themselves, has been around building stronger civil society networks around anti-racism that are trying to create quite, I suppose, more savvy and more connected civil society networks. That's one of the things that they've been trying to do. Recognizing there are limitations there in terms of what can be done in the political arena, because they've got a significant proportion of their local government is now either AFD or pro-Chemnitz, who are a more radical party. So that's been one of the things that they have done as part of that. I think the other thing, again, thinking of what they've been doing in Chemnitz, is just that awareness of how responses are likely to be weaponized. So however, whether it's public authority, whether it's police, however they respond is likely to be picked up on. I think there's also something in there about where possible, kind of work with those political actors to try to kind of understand their relation, how they are being used by far-right actors. And actually, I think in Sunderland there was some of that. But actually, the Sunderland, well, Sunderland case is a bit different, I suppose, because it's movement emboldened at a local, but movement marginalised at national. It's a bit complicated. But I think one of the things there that was done in a really smart way was that the local authority, the public authorities, actually responded very clearly to a number of the grievance issues being raised. And they said, actually, look, so for example, they held public meetings where they were willing to have very difficult conversations around, for example, asylum accommodation and distribution of crime in the city. It was a very difficult conversation, but they were prepared to have it, so they couldn't be accused of hiding it. And that was actually very effective in terms of taking some of the fuel that's being focused on, ideas about, local authorities are doing cover-ups. Well, actually, you couldn't really say that because they were then at least talking openly. So I think that there are. Sorry, this has been turned into a long rambling answer. But so I think there are things that you can do, but I think it's enormously challenging.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think that's a really thorough and useful answer. But I think with that, we're probably getting very close to the hour. So we're going to have to look to wrapping up this session now. It's been absolutely fascinating from my perspective, and I should say that we're getting lots of thanks also from members of the audience through the Q&A as well. So it's been very well received and extremely interesting. I do want to remind everyone that it will be up on the AVERT website to look at and access later on. So please do spread the word about this presentation to colleagues and others who might be interested. Do feel free also to join the AVERT mailing list and follow us on LinkedIn and also on YouTube as well. Now, for future webinars, we will be having another webinar in May. It'll be on the 15th of May, 9 a.m. East Coast Australian time. And we'll be talking with Dr. Julia Chernoff-Huang, who's going to be speaking about the disbandment of Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia. So we really hope to see many of you here for that presentation as well. And Joel, just once again, thank you so much. We're looking forward to having you back sometime in the future. Cheers.
No, thanks very much. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, everyone.